Hi, my name is Jin, and I'm a medical student at the University of Wisconsin, working with Wisconsin Voices for Recovery to bring you Saturday Night Chat. Saturday Night Chat is a monthly chat that creates a space for people to share their recovery journey and to show people in and seeking recovery that they are not alone and that recovery is possible. Today, we'll be hearing from Sarah. Sarah, thank you so much for chatting with me today. Would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a bit about your story of recovery?
Sure. So my name's Sarah. I'm a person in long-term recovery first and foremost. I am also the peer and community coordinator for a nonprofit organization called Three Bridges Recovery. Um, I worked my way up through recovery coaching, peer support, and obviously surviving active substance use. And I'm here now. Um, so should I just go ahead and start going into the story?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I really want to focus more on my recovery journey than my actual active use. I utilize many pathways of recovery throughout my journey to get me where I'm at right now. Um, I started out as a kid who had experienced, several childhood adverse childhood experiences, and my father was abusive and struggled with substance use disorder as well. We moved around a lot. So I come from that sort of background and struggled with coping and ended up finding substances in middle school into high school. And through that time, it was this is normal. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. We experiment. This is what kids do. Um, the only difference, hindsight's 2020, is whereas my friends were partying on the weekend, I had been drinking since Thursday, or if things like that. Same thing with THC or any substances I was using at that time. I ended up throughout that getting a bad kidney infection from dehydration and was prescribed Oxycontin. And after that, I was no longer interested in any other substances. This was around the age of 15, and this is an age, you can't even legally drive yet, much less make a decision on what's best for your life. So I like to point that out when it comes to that whole argument between, substance use being a choice versus a disease. I was not even old enough, much less in middle school or at 16, to choose a disease or understand how it would impact my life going forward. So my substance use progressed, and by the time I was 19, I became dependent on heroin and was IV using. I had done a lot of things, stole from my family, did a lot of things that wouldn't align with my value system at all. And once at 19, I had only been using heroin for about 2 months when I ended up going to my first treatment. Um, you know, Throughout that whole time using recreational substances and things on the street, it was not, I didn't recognize that I had had any sort of problem until the name changed to heroin. Then I was like, okay, this is definitely a problem. But at the same time, it was like meeting my new true love, and we had just met, and it had only been 2 months. So I went to a treatment facility out in Michigan, and it was my mom and my sister had found it for me, and that was my first treatment. And after that, I actually had to leave there early because I connected with one of uh the other patients there, and we stole from the nurses station, and I just was not ready to stop. A few months following treatment, I was right back to using heroin, and um, I spent the next about 3 years stuck in that cycle of find, fund, use. That was all my world revolved around. Um, and to, and I like to tell people, like, my substance use survived on the same $200 for a long time. I was using, I was dealing, I wasn't any major dealer. It was just enough to get me by, get a pack of cigarettes, put gas in so I could go get more. And so around 2015, 2016, I used too much. I ran out. I didn't have enough to go get more. And I got this brilliant idea to rob a Denny's. Um, Anybody listening to this might be familiar. It was in the city of Wisconsin Dells, which is where I did a lot of my running around and spent most of my childhood. And so that Denny's that's like chromed out with Elvis and stuff in front of it. I robbed that Denny's. I uh got in this high-speed chase, rolled my car, high-speed chase with the waiter, not with like not with police or anything. Um, and my only thought in that whole thing, and I look back at that now, is as long as I got high one more time, I did not care what the consequences were. My only goal was I needed to get high. Um, I was willing to go to jail as long as I got high first. I was willing to do whatever as long as I um, fed that need. And I consider the reason I bring up the Denny story is I consider it a pivotal moment for my recovery. Um, I rolled my car. That was my transportation, my means to the find, fund, use cycle. And I was living in that car. So when I lost that car, I had nothing left um, to my name or to move forward. And that made me stuck. I did make it that night to get high again, and I hid out over the weekend, and my sister came and picked me up and brought me up to Wisconsin Rapids. And Wisconsin Rapids is where I ended up starting to find my recovery. So once again, I'm 30 now. It's 2024. This was around 2015, 2016. I spent about 3 months after that just in complete misery. I did not understand why anyone was willing to do life sober. I was like, how do you function? You're just happy to be here. You just go to a grocery store and go grocery shopping. Like the simplest of tasks that people do in their day-to-day lives seemed impossible to me without using. And I lived in this robe in my little sister's bedroom watching American Horror Story for like 3 months, just miserable. And I finally told them, I'm gonna get high or I'm gonna die. Like I can't do this anymore. And so it's my mom and my sister back on the phone again, trying to figure out how to help me. And that's when I started attending a methadone clinic. And I ended up uh, actually utilizing, I know they have a less stigmatizing word for it now, but utilizing medication assisted treatment for the next 2.5 years. And in that first year, I started getting my life together. I started getting a job. I started being able to participate and do things like grocery shopping and things that I couldn't comprehend before. And then into that second year at the clinic, I started associating, hanging out with other people there that were still actively using. And that's when a whole new addiction or a whole new substance came into the picture and I started using methamphetamines and benzos. In that time, to me, that was harm reduction. At least it's not heroin. I have less risk of overdosing. Now, with the benzos, there was a higher risk of overdosing with the medication I was on. I was receiving a dose of 190 milligrams at the methadone clinic, and I ended up blacking out basically a couple of weeks and had no idea. But by the time I guess came back to and I was at the clinic to get my dose, they went to give me 90 milligrams. And I was like, no, my dose is 190. And they were like, you have been dropped twice because you've had positive urines for benzodiazepines. And I didn't even remember. A lot of they had told me that I had went and just dumped my sister's urine into the thing right in front of them during an observed UA. And I only knew this because of people that had rode up with me to the clinic. I didn't remember. So I decided I'm not going to go to the clinic anymore. There's no point if I'm going to have to be sick and go through withdrawals. And I went back to the streets and continued using amphetamines and benzodiazepines for, it still to me felt like it was just a month or two. But I believe it ended up being close to 6 to 8 months. And I just one day, this is once again through blackouts and coming back in, I just one day was going through withdrawals. I had run out of everything, and these withdrawals were different. I had this terrible twitch where my whole body, I was flinging cigarettes across the room. When I was walking, my knees would buckle. Something that was not part of my usual withdrawals. And, my mom and my sister, once again, are like, you need to go to the hospital. This isn't normal. And I had no desire to go to the hospital. I had so much fear of the stigma there and the judgment. And I just knew they weren't going to help me. And so it took my mom calling my sister to drive back from Wisconsin Dells, and which is about an hour drive, and drag me out of bed, shower me, dress me because I just could not function, and then take me to the emergency room. When I went into the emergency room, it was exactly as I had imagined it. This guy, when we're trying to figure out what's wrong, he's like, well, the best way to avoid this is not to do drugs. And when I did sorry, we had some people pop in the office, but so right away, I didn't feel taken seriously. I felt afraid. Um, whatever is wrong with me right now isn't going to be properly looked into or checked because it's just, quote unquote, I'm a junkie coming into the emergency department room. And so they did do one thing different that they hadn't done before, which they had called in a recovery coach. And I have permission to use her name. I've shared our story several times, but that's when Megan had come in. And in the few minutes she was there, we had started talking. I ended up having a grand mal seizure. So I woke up from that. I'm not sure how long later. And my mom and sister are leaning over me, and the doctor's talking to me, and I thought that it was still May, and it was actually August. This is in 2018. During that period of time, I had blacked out. I had received a second OWI that I had no recollection of. My mom said, you have court, coming up. And I was like, for what? And once again, with the doctor, I was concerned. I'd never had a seizure before. So I said, is my brain okay? Like, is this going to be a reoccurring thing? Is this going to keep happening? Like, and when I asked if my brain was okay, he said, oh, no, you don't have one. And once again, like, now I chuckle about it, but at the time it was terrifying because I'm like, this is who's supposed to make sure I'm okay. And he's not going to take me seriously. He's not going to look into things. There was no, CAT scans or anything like that done. But Megan, the recovery coach that was in there, stayed there that whole night. waited until I woke up from my seizure to speak to me, comforted my family, discussed the different options. I feel like she went above and beyond even what her duties as a recovery coach was. But my sister and my mom had no idea what to do with me. I had no idea what to do with me, and I was in no position to advocate for myself at that point. And she had convinced the hospital to hang on to me a little longer while they got detox set up because I mean, I said like I'm gonna use if I leave here. I have no, I'm going through severe withdrawals. And they got me set up with detox. And this is another pivotal moment I like to point out in my story because as of August of 2018, I was no longer physically dependent on substances. So, while, my recovery, my current sustained recovery, I'm coming up on 5 years. So, it started in 2020. So obviously I didn't maintain complete sobriety after that, but the fact that I no longer needed something to avoid those withdrawals was huge for me and a form of harm reduction. And in that, I I I point out all of these things because I believe each thing that happened is very important to where I'm at today. Um, so I started being more careful. I would make sure I only used 3 to 4 days a week. So I used moderation as a form of harm reduction and recovery for a long time. And then on January 12th of 2020, I found out I was pregnant. Um, for me, this was devastating. I never planned on having children. I did not think I was capable of even being sober long enough to get through a pregnancy. I actually used the very next day on the 13th of January, and then I spent the night Googling things. And so as of January 14th, 2020, that was my last time, or 13th was the last time I ever used. And January 14th, 2020 was my first day of complete abstinence. Throughout that first 6 months of pregnancy, I was very, I can't wait until this baby gets out of me. I planned on using as soon as I had this baby. My mindset with it, I still struggled. I'll have a lot of people say, well, you got pregnant. That's how you did it, and it's like, no, I still wanted to use. I was the most uncomfortable I had ever been. And at the time, the first 6 months, I didn't work any form of recovery. I was just like remaining abstinent and miserable and, you know, waiting until I had this baby so I could use again. And about 6 months in, the father of my child ended up overdosing. Um, I had to walk 10 blocks pregnant to go wake him up, bring him back, and um he's still alive now, but at the time it hit me like shit. Who's gonna take care of this baby? Because that was my plan. He had been doing better than I was. And I was like, who's gonna take care of this baby? I'm not, in any city. I'm literally just biding my time so I can get high again. And um I say that as another pivotal point in my recovery because then I started to try and do something. Um, I spent hours crying in the shower, you know, praying to whoever was listening, just trying to like, I just wanted that desire to be gone. And I was spending so much time like, I wanted to not want it, but but I still wanted it. And that'll make sense to anybody in recovery when I say it to anyone who's doesn't struggle with substance use. They're like, what do you mean? You know? But I was very uh I got determined and I started attending things like 12-step meetings. Something else that had happened after the emergency department visit, so I'm backtracking again, was I started outpatient treatment, and I did the Vivitrol shot for 30 days, and I would go back and forth throughout that 2 years, having 30 days of abstinence, 60 days of abstinence, back to use, and but I say now too, like, what happened with that detox and the fact that I got to a point of utilizing that moderation approach, I if I was still physically dependent, I don't believe I would have been able to stop once I found out I was pregnant. Um, and I try to point out every turning point in my story. While I wasn't all the way there yet, without that, I wouldn't be where I am today. And so with the pregnancy and the abstinence, then I just started doing everything. Um, Attending 12-step meetings, churches, Bible studies, just being anywhere I could be, whether it was just for a distraction for a few minutes or for to get insight to hopefully change my mind. And to this day, I can't identify the day that I woke up and that desire was gone. It was something I hoped and prayed for so long, and I can't identify that day. I could tell you every day, I could tell you how it felt the first time, every time I used a different substance, but I can't put my finger on the day that, like, all of a sudden that desire was gone. And I started collecting key tags from 12-step meetings and doing random projects, buying all kinds of baby supplies. When I had my son, I ended up actually largely depending on him to keep me sober. I breastfed him for like 3 years, almost two years, because for me that was the biggest part that could, okay, he's still getting what I'm getting, and that was something that could help me remain abstinent. But during that time, I was able to actually establish a recovery community, a support network, um, build a life that I didn't feel like I needed to escape from anymore, learn coping mechanisms, um, and it was a lot of just being uncomfortable for a while, but then it got to the point where I was more comfortable in situations like 12-step meetings or uh churches than I was uh in the hood or in the trap house or in any of those. I don't know what a non-stigmatizing term is for that. So those are the terms you're getting from me that way. Um so now I have I will have 5 years of complete abstinence on January of 2025. It goes perfectly with the years, which helps me remember. And um, I know some people say, well, don't front yourself sober time, but I really, and this whole 5 years hasn't been some sort of cakewalk or, perfect by any means. But, we talk about all the time, like there's triggers, cravings, urges, that lead to that active use. And I still get triggers. I still have using thoughts, but I rarely get to that point of having an actual urge or that feeling that I need to use. And that is something that, on slow days when I'm sitting here, I'm like, I'm just okay sitting here right now, like happy to be here. And that was once something I couldn't even understand. Um, but the biggest thing I like to highlight about my story is, oh, well, first of all, now I supervise that program. So Megan, who came into the emergency department, I was the first emergency department call for the organization Three Bridges. And now I supervise the emergency department to recovery program for Three Bridges. And for it still gives me goosebumps to this day, because she used to say, like, you could be where I am and you could be helping people, you'd be really good at it. And I'd be looking at her like, girl, there is no way. Like the thought of getting a year sober was like, seemed impossible to me. I remember people at 12-step meetings collecting their 1 year key tag, and I'm like, what were they addicted to? Tylenol? There's no way that they're just staying sober for a whole year. Um, and even once I got my first year, I thought, this is it. I'm cured. I'm better. Everything's smooth sailing from here. No, I have still had to find different ways to feed my recovery. Now it's not so much church or 12-step meetings. Now it's doing things with my son or working on my house. In the last 4.5 years, I've gone from being, you know, homeless, penniless, um, hopeless, depressed, like having that sense of no purpose, to I'm now a landlord, a homeowner. I have a car and a valid driver's license. I can get pulled over and like drive away afterwards. I won't forget my first time getting pulled over in recovery. I didn't even know how to drive away. I was like, we usually leave these things together. So do I let you go first? Do I leave first? Do I let you assert dominance? How does this work? It was very awkward, and I kind of just stopped and goed out of the parking lot for a minute, trying to decide the proper way to do this. But I really wanted to focus mostly on my recovery and less on my active substance use, because I feel like I've utilized many pathways of recovery. And I think that goes to show how nonlinear that recovery is, how different it can look for somebody, and how even if, one thing stops working for you, it doesn't mean that's it. There's so many other options. And I've learned that a lot with this job as well. I've met people who do out of the box things to stay sober. Some days the way I stay sober is, taking one of my family members through the car wash and rolling the window down on them, and that's my joy for the day. Um, it it can look different every day, every year. So I know there's a lot of stigma involved in with harm reduction or moderation um or IV use. Through my IV use, I utilized uh life point programs and things like that, and I believe that's the reason I was one out of two people in a treatment facility that had 96 that did not have hepatitis C. Like, that's how prevalent and common it is. And all of my friends that I know in recovery have had some sort of treatment for hepatitis C, and I didn't. And I'm not immune. I did all the same sharing and different things that they did once in a while, but uh I didn't. I didn't ever hit rock bottom. That's a big stigmatized thing that people talk about, is rock bottom. And, I had a lot of miserable events and ended up in a lot of bad spots. But something that kept me using um was that whole stigma of rock. I'm not a felon. I did not experience the longest time that I've spent in jail is 8 days in a row. I was bailed out all the other times. I've escaped this whole substance use disorder without any felonies. Uh, Even the Denny's thing was just a minor theft charge, which for me, that makes me paranoid now, because I'm like, I got no more golden tickets. I can't do anything wrong now, or because I will get caught. Um, but that was something, plus I was 25, 26 when I found out I was pregnant, and I was like, I'm too young. Like, nobody gets sober this young. It's unheard of. I still have a lot of years left in me. I don't have any felonies. I haven't lost, you know, my family still loves me even if they don't trust me. I I let that stigma of needing to hit that rock bottom keep me from recovery for a little while too. And it's like, you know, any anybody who's thinking logically and rationally about it is like, well, why would you wait until you hit that? And that's what I got to a point of, like, I don't need to go any further down. There's no such thing as the lowest. We can find a new rock bottom every time until this disease takes our lives. And and I'm grateful that I didn't have to, keep doing that. And I hope to continue to stay in recovery and maintain that today. I guess, do you have any questions? I know I'm a talker.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I learned so much from hearing your story and hearing about all the work that you've put in to get to the point that you're at now. And I'm sure a lot of the people watching will learn a lot from that too. Um, I had a couple of questions about the emergency department recovery program that had helped you and that you now run. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about what these recovery coaches do and how someone or a hospital could get connected with a recovery coach.
Absolutely. So the Emergency Department to Recovery program is something funded by Wisconsin Voices of Recovery. And recovery coaches are able to go in to the emergency room and meet with patients when they are in this vulnerable place. As I had said in my story, like, I was in no position to advocate for myself. And having a recovery coach or peer support specialist in there makes a world of difference. And now that's something that we do. So we go into these emergency departments, we meet, and we're there for them and to advocate for their wants and needs. We might have mom or the doctor, someone like, they need treatment, they need to go now. Whereas maybe they're just interested in harm reduction, um, or maybe they're not interested in anything yet, but they now know that there's someone that just supports them and is there to treat them as a resource and show them they have that autonomy in those situations. Because being stuck, I mean, in the emergency room, you can feel like you have no choice. You're surrounded by all these authoritative figures. And, um, but that is something when they are looking for treatment or harm reduction or whatever it is that their need is in that moment. Recovery coaches and peer support specialists are able to connect them with those resources. Um, be that kind of resource Rolodex is what I call us for the county, the area that we're working in, and be knowledgeable. Because when I was in the emergency room, just had a seizure, you could hand me a folder full of resources. It's too overwhelming. It would have been too overwhelming. I was sick, there was no way I was going to go through and try to call these phone numbers. Whereas we can sit there and do these things with these individuals and empower them, to realize they can take control back over their lives and show them that they, ultimately they are in control. They just haven't felt like it for a while.
That sounds like a really great program. I'm really glad that there's something like that that exists. You had also talked about after you had been in recovery for a while, you had established a network of people and resources that had helped you. I was wondering about how you would recommend people work on finding a good support system.
So that is a huge question we get all the time, right? Everybody's like, we're not in middle school, we're not in high school anymore, where we're going to a new school and can just make new friends. And that was my big thing too. I'm like, what do you know, how do you even meet people out here? And we live in Wisconsin, where the culture is, you know, the way everybody socializes is at bars. And um so what I did, like I spoke about, like the 12-step meetings and churches and different, I was basically, it wasn't about finding a program for me. It wasn't about finding a higher power for me when I started doing those things. It was just about being around people that were able to live without substances. And so by me being in those places and exposing myself to those people, I was able to build and branch off that network. And it doesn't, that's something I tell peers that I work with all the time. Like, you don't have to go to a church looking for God. You don't have to go to a 12-step meeting looking to work the steps or smart recovery or whatever. But that is where the people that are trying to do the same things you are located. You know, we're just trying to do better, trying to feel better, trying to be healthier. And I just started putting myself in those situations. And now I have tons of friends, way more friends than I had using. And I like them a lot more too. You know?
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And I know that it can be challenging sometimes to reach out to people or resources because there is so much stigma associated with substance use and recovery. So what can people do if they want to support people who are either using substances or in recovery? And what would you recommend for them in terms of way that they can help reduce stigma when talking to their friends or their loved ones?
So one of the biggest things, and I know we've had plenty of movements going on with this regarding language. Um, Another piece, like I didn't even realize how important language was as a person in recovery until I went to a doctor's appointment. I had already been sober for 3 years. It was a psychiatry appointment, and I was concerned that they were going to put me on something that interfered with breastfeeding. And so I'm asking about this medication being safe for breastfeeding. And the nurse looks at me and goes, well, you're breastfeeding? Meth and heroin aren't safe for breastfeeding. And because it was documented in my chart right at the top of the list that I was an active heroin and meth abuser, you know, and nobody associates those terms with anything positive. You're not even thinking about a person when you're using that terminology. You're thinking about something small, something less than, something that is undesirable. And, and I had her fix that in my chart right away, change to history of substance use disorder. I don't mind if it's in there, but that wasn't even what I was there for that day. Um, and I say that, there are certain, obviously, like 12-step programs that discuss, you identify yourself as an addict, and for that program, that's their path. So I'm not going to sit here and tell them not to do what's working for them. But in the professional world, or as far as families and friends go, using language that identifies people as people first. And I mean, we can, the person first language is something preached about everywhere. I know that, but it's also, it, it makes a difference. If like, this is my sister, she's an addict, or, she abuses substances, or versus, she's my sister, it's not, this disease that people are struggling with isn't their entire identity. And once we stop making it their entire identity, it makes it a lot easier for those who are still struggling to realize it's not their entire identity too, and give them the opportunity to find out what those other identities are. And so yeah, language I think is one of the biggest things. And then just support. I hate the term enabling. I think everyone, no matter what they're doing, deserves food, shelter, water. I'm not telling you to, go buy your friend who's struggling with substance use, pay for their substances, but everyone deserves access to food, shelter, and water. And those are basic things that can make the difference too for someone to uh, move on in life. So just that continued love and compassion, and just really understanding that this isn't this is a disease, it's not a moral failing. And these struggles where we end up going against our values when we're using and against our morals, it's a symptom. And if it starts to be treated as such, then we can actually identify and hopefully eliminate this disease.
Yeah, that's a really great way to think about that. Thank you for sharing about that. We're just about out of time, but before we end, is there anything else that you wanted to share, that you wanted to tell people who are watching?
I guess my big thing, my soapbox is stigma, and harm reduction. I mentioned it many times throughout my story. Like my recovery started probably 8 years ago, but my sustained abstinence started the last 4 years. And throughout my story, without each of those options of harm reduction, of someone coming in to help advocate for me against that stigma, I wouldn't be where I am today. So I think it's important to those of y'all that are in the helping profession, recovery coaching, peer support. Megan wasn't my go-to for the next 2 years, but just her being in that space planted that seed and made an entire difference as to where my recovery would end up. So just keep doing what you guys are doing, and take care of yourselves and end stigma. That's how I'll close.
That's a good closing thought. Well, so that wraps up our Saturday night chat for this month. But Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your story. It was so great to hear about your experiences, and I'm sure that this will be really helpful for a lot of people watching.
Yeah, thank you for having me.